you could even see in a country like France, where you normally have people protest and challenge. They were totally quiet. There was nobody challenging that lockdown in France, because people were afraid.
People were afraid.
This is probably the correct thing to do.
Easy to control a people that's scared.
Yes. And we've seen that. I mean, now there are opportunities to control a population using this type of fear. So I think that's a bit of a scary part of this.
We have to be a bit careful, perhaps, to see where this goes.
Because you can justify this type of measures.
Welcome to Mind the Shift, a podcast about a shifting world and shifting minds. I am Anders Bolling. In almost every corner of the world, we have lived in a state of emergency for a year now. The pandemic is still here, although hopes are that the vaccines will ease the pressure soon. Some stress that this disease is less lethal than many others and think the measures are exaggerated. Others deem it a disaster. Humankind has had plenty of disasters, for sure. Natural as well as man-made. The Spanish flu killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million, mainly young people 100 years ago. Floods killed 4 million people in China in 1931. Famine killed 1 million in Ethiopia in the 1980s. A tsunami killed 200,000 people in South Asia in 2004. We need to get better at helping each other when disaster strikes, and we have become better. My guest today is a professor in global disaster medicine at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and the head of the Center for Research on Healthcare in Disasters at the same institute. He's a medical doctor specialized in general surgery. He did his first field work for Doctors Without Borders in the late 1980s and has continued to work with that organization as well as for World Health Organization during disasters. For example, in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, Ukraine during the war there, and in Iraq and in Yemen. And after the outbreak of COVID-19, he has been an advisor on disaster medicine to the Swedish National Board of Health. And last fall, he was deployed as an emergency medical technician coordinator. That was a difficult thing to say. An emergency medical technician coordinator.
Emergency medical teams coordinator.
Oh, teams. Sorry. Emergency medical teams coordinator for WHO in Lebanon following the enormous blast in the harbor in Beirut. He has also published the book Katastrofdoktorn, The Disaster Doctor. Welcome to the show, Johan von Schreeb.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So, have you been back now from Lebanon for some time, or do you still have the assignment there?
So, it was to the end of 2020, but of course I remain in contact, and now we're trying to publish some of the work we did. First of all, of the experience of international deployments to Lebanon, but also looking on, or describing rather, how to scale up ICU beds for COVID care in this type of context, in the public sector in a middle-income country, and the challenges of maintaining quality. So I try to balance field work, understanding what's happening in the field in the contemporary disasters, and bring that back to the university and try to sort of do research on it, package it, and then publish in order to sort of have some evidence or improve the evidence base for these type of interventions.
Yeah. So you've been back for a few weeks now,
yes,
a couple of months.
Yes.
Okay. So how was that? I mean, there was a gigantic blast in the harbor. There was a warehouse that blew up, and it contained, I don't know, some chemical. I can't remember which
fertilizers.
One. Fertilizers, yeah. It was just enormous, and many people died. And when you were called to go down there, was your job mainly
over the years, so coming back to my experience, so in 2010 I worked with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in Haiti, and that was when I had also done my PhD, and my PhD was focused on looking on how international response can improve. And one of the findings was that international teams, medical teams, are deployed without really understanding the context. and not also either taking consideration on the type of hazards or what will be the needs. Is more like a reflex, humanitarian reflex, to send field hospitals, and it's sort of been considered to be a priori good to do that. But then I started out being a bit more critical towards that, and together with the World Health Organization, we started this what's called Emergency Medical Teams Initiative back in 2010, and then 2013 was the actual publication where we did a classification. We set standards for international deployments, because previously anybody just wanting to do good could send a team of doctors or surgeons and start operating anywhere without any accountabilities. There was no surge functions, there was no coordination, because the affected country really didn't have the resources to manage incoming teams, especially if it was a low-income country affected. So this sort of over the years has developed now quite nicely into becoming a platform, or you can say like a 112 number that affected governments can call upon. And the teams that can respond, they can be, depending on their level, they can be like a health center or a hospital or an advanced hospital, different categories. And then for each level, there are specific standards, meaning that you need to adhere to these standards, and you need to be, so to say, verified by the World Health Organization to see whether you adhere to these standards. And then, so now there's a team of 30 or 40 international teams, ranging from health centers up to advanced hospitals, that are ready to be deployed within a very short notice. And you can also hold them accountable, you can coordinate them. So when the Beirut blast happened on August 4th, I was asked by the World Health Organization to travel to Beirut to support the WHO office in Lebanon, to coordinate these incoming teams, because that's what was for certain. There was going to be a lot of teams and field hospitals arriving.
Yeah.
But now we had a mechanism to coordinate and to hold teams accountable and to task them to different areas. And very quickly, of course, it became clear that Lebanon, there was no need for trauma care. It was very well managed within the system, as you said.
Yeah, because it's not a very poor country.
No, and also they have very commercialized healthcare, you can say so. Okay. Within the city they have more MRIs per capita than we do in Stockholm, for example, because it's really adapted. And to commercialized healthcare. So there were all these services available. There were around 42 hospitals actually that receive injured. And there were a lot of injured, some up around 6,000 injured. Only 200 died, despite this horrible blast. But 85% of those injured were very lightly injured, so they could be sort of catered for outside, basically, the hospitals, be sutured or stapled, and then they could go home. And then only around 15% of those injured, so 800 or 900 or something, were actually admitted to hospitals, and among them, many of them could go home the next day. So actually, the health system in Lebanon managed very well to take care of these injured, even though they had economic problems but they had the human resources and really the experience, because, as you know, Lebanon has gone through many disasters, civil war and car bombs, and so they have done their homework, and they're really experienced. So they managed very well. But despite that, of course, a lot of international teams were deployed. But then, thanks to these mechanisms that we had, we were able to control, you could say, WHO to ask for the correct type of assistance, and then retask those that arrived within this civilian mechanism, WHO EMT mechanisms, and ask them rather to focus on COVID care, because that was something that
happened afterwards. You kind of refocused,
And then, despite that there were no needs, there were a lot of military hospitals. And this is something that we've seen recently, how military start acting also in the so-called humanitarian crises. And there's no way that the WHO can control the militaries. And there's a political dimension to that, which I think we have only started to understand, and bilateral deployments. So there were field hospitals from Morocco, from Jordan, from Italy, and that was, I think, the most fascinating thing. They arrived from Italy with the military field hospitals to care for trauma, and they were ready to start treating patients 1 month after. So you really wonder, what did these people that deployed, how did they think about the situation? So it was almost like an insult, and I was really trying to get them to since I was there as the coordinator for WHO, I was telling them, please, can you retask to do COVID care instead? Because that's really where the needs will be. And actually, this Italian field hospital, they had been deployed in Italy during the spring. So they knew how to take care of COVID. But they were not allowed to do this. And we were really struggling to try to do that. So overall, the international response was good in the sense that we could redirect it, and the civilian, these emergency medical teams that were within the WHO mechanism, they instead of doing trauma care, they started providing support to the public system to deal with COVID, and we were scaling up ICU beds and so most of these international teams that arrived within that mechanisms, they had previous experience of working with COVID in Italy and in Poland and other. So actually, because
was it fairly new to Lebanon at that time?
Yeah, because they,
pandemic?
Actually was it was the first wave because they were very quick in closing the borders during the spring. So there were very few cases, so there was no experience really of dealing with COVID, even though, of course, they had made plans. But as we all know, with plans, they don't start working until we have the knife on the throat, so to say. And
sometimes the plans are thrown out the window also.
Then with this economic collapse that happened 2019, I think there were a lot of other issues that the Lebanese health system had to deal with. So, of course, they were... they had plans, but a lot of these plans had not been implemented. But so it was very useful, I think, for these internationals to come to share their experience. So in that sense, the deployment and my role totally shifted from really trauma care of injured to COVID care. And I think we made quite a difference. And there are still these teams that are still in Lebanon now. And we have managed to support the Ministry of Health to go from around 200 ICU beds to over 1,000 ICU beds. And where in a system where the public system is extremely weak, and most healthcare, 85% of healthcare is provided by the private system. So that's another dimension that I find very fascinating, how to engage the private health system in disasters. And we see this also in Sweden now. How that the public system has to do everything. So can you leave the private to just skim the milk, or should they also be held accountable and also and then you need to write good contracts with them and hold them accountable.
But this thing with Lebanon, I mean, how severe has the epidemic, the pandemic been in that country since then? I mean, compared to other countries, there are so many countries that have been affected very severely, and if the blast hadn't happened, maybe I mean, the WHO would never have sent teams specifically to Lebanon to do this.
No,
I mean, you could just
clear.
as well have gone to dozens of other countries to help them with the COVID care.
That's very true. But what you could see is after the 4th of August, the cases started increasing quite rapidly. And especially since the end of the last 6 weeks, you can say that the numbers has gone up dramatically. And then around 4 weeks ago, they put on quite a hard lockdown. There were some lockdowns during the autumn, but in December they really started a strict, or just after New Year's Eve, actually there was a hard lockdown. And I think that was a bit of the problem, and we've seen that in other countries where it's been relaxed over Christmas because families must get together and you want to open the shops and etc. But really it exploded, and then you had an exponential growth. So it was totally out of control for a while. Now it has gone down a bit, but still the health system is really overwhelmed and is barely managing. And because it's the blast, it was 12 hours hard work or 24 hours hard work for most people. This has now been in Lebanon 6 months of hard work, and so when it comes to disasters, just thinking of the type of hazard that you're exposed to, that is important to understand. Is it something that will go on for a long time, or is it this type of just one type of event, terrorist attack, or you can say also earthquakes if they happen in but then of course you need to deal with the rubble. And also if there's a lot of injuries and bone fractures, etc., that will take some time to recover. But in general, I think we are not very good on analyzing the type of health needs that are after disasters. We tend to be perplexed over that. Oh, it's a disaster. We have to send the field hospital. But that's been my research a lot, that we have to understand better. We have to critically analyze. It's somehow that it appeals to some humanitarian instinct inside of us. We want to do something, but exactly what to do, I think that we need to understand better.
We think that something is better than nothing, but sometimes maybe nothing is better than that thing that we send.
Yeah, and then also I think we have to understand also the local capacities. I think we tend to, it's a very, I'd say, paternalistic or colonial view that we have on disasters in other countries, that we have to come to their rescue. And I think that
on one hand, very poor knowledge of poor and medium income countries, how they are.
So basically what we're dealing with is, on one hand, the vulnerabilities of the country, meaning the socioeconomic situation, but also the capacity of the health system and the resilience of the population. So that's one dimension. Then you have the actual hazard. And a disaster doesn't happen until hazard meets a vulnerability. So what you could do is either reduce the hazard, which sometimes is difficult. You can't take away the virus. You can't take away an earthquake. To some extent, we could take away some flooding by building less
levees.
But mainly what we're dealing with here is to reducing vulnerabilities. And if we look globally on disasters, we've been very good on that globally. A country like Bangladesh, for example, has been extraordinarily successful in reducing vulnerability.
Yeah.
You were talking about how many millions were dying in 1971. There was 500,000 people that were dying in Bangladesh from typhoons. And then gradually that basically has come to a very low number, a few thousand.
Yes, I often have that as an example myself. Bangladesh is a good example because there was a cyclone in 1971. There was one big they've had several, but the same size cyclone in 1991. And then there was a third one about the same size in 2008, I think it was, 7 or 8. And in the first one, as you said, 500,000 people died. The second one, 140,000. And the last one, I think, 4,000 died. So it's extremely salient.
And they've done everything correct. I mean, if you look on Bangladesh and how many people live there, do you know how many people would live in Sweden if we would have the same density as they do in Bangladesh?
I don't know, maybe 1 billion?
450 million.
450. Well,
so it's very dense. Yeah. It's very dense, and obviously the delta and it's extremely dense there, and it's also flat, meaning that there's no way to run if the water increases, and you have the Ganges from the back, and then you have the ocean from the other side. So there's really no way to escape. But what they've done is building this. Cyclone shelters where people can actually go and seek shelter. They have better warning systems, so we have much more intelligence now. Text messages or
people have phones also, their own phones.
Course.
I mean, compared to how it used to be. So they get the information.
So and then they will know what to do. But then of course you have the indirect effects, which is the cattle will die, the rice with salt water, the crops may be destroyed. So people survive, but the poverty and that's really becoming the big issue now. How to recover following this type of, whether it's flooding or this type of typhoons. It's really putting a lot of strain on already people who are living with basic economies.
Of course. So Bangladesh is an excellent example of a country that has had its fair share of disasters, as is Lebanon, which is a country that have had very many different types of disasters. You're talking about bombs. They were pretty used to bombs, I guess, and terrorist attacks, but also natural disasters and now COVID-19, like every country has. So disasters come in many shapes and forms. So, it might be difficult for a layman to compare an earthquake with a flood and a pandemic and all that, but are there any common features, and how does well, these are many questions actually. We can just start with the common features. What would you say is common among all kinds of disasters that you see?
I think it's interesting with the word disaster, because it means different to different people. If my whatever girlfriend or boyfriend breaks up, that can be a disaster, so it's on
For sure.
different, if it can be on very many different levels. But in my world, we talk about it that it's some sort of break of equilibrium. So something happens, it's a crack of some kind, and that crack can come quickly or slowly, but that break of equilibrium creates damages to health, to economy, to infrastructure, and all those effects, they cause problems that exceed the capacity of those that are affected by it. So basically, those are the components that I use and I think are most commonly used as the definition of a disaster. So, which means that sort of this normality will vary a lot. I mean, a lot of people in low income countries, they live they survive in a way that I wouldn't survive more than a few days with how they manage to cope. So we have coping capacities, we have resilience that are the mechanisms that you use in order to survive. And we, in Sweden, for example, up north, if you travel, you need to have a shovel and you need to have warm clothes, because if your car breaks down, you will die unless you have these gears with you. While in Stockholm here, nobody thinks about that. So that factor of resilience is another one that also needs to be included. And I think on a personal level, we can also have different levels of resilience. And I think the Swedish society, we have been very spared from disasters. So I would argue that our resilience has been not very extensive. And
so would a disaster of the scale that they experience in like Lebanon and Bangladesh affect Swedes worse than people in those countries, because we're not used to it? We don't have the resilience. We don't have the...
I think on a societal level or individual level, I think initially at least people would complain a lot. But once you are confronted with this type of situation, and I think we saw that during the spring in Sweden with the COVID care, that, for example, the healthcare system managed very quickly to redirect and got rid of stupid routines and this bureaucracy that's been a pest to the system and has really taken away the pleasure of working.
Yeah.
I think a lot of colleagues I discussed, they were very happy that they could actually practice medicine and not practice bureaucracy. And so I think in that sense, we managed to adapt, but I think we've been spared. We haven't had war for over 200 years, so of course this will affect our soul, and we don't even have a narrative about disaster. When you're in Lebanon, everybody has a narrative about disasters, and my friends down there, they one of my friends, his brother had been killed in a bomb during the Civil War, and then he had been out working. He came back with his money, and then last year all his savings were suddenly gone because of this economic crash, the bank. So all these things, I sort of started freaking out and thinking, how would I react myself in front of this? I don't have a narrative. I don't have any experience.
But I mean, it's
this.
Interesting to ponder whether that's an advantage or a disadvantage, because I mean, it's all a mindset.
Yes.
If you are expecting disasters every day or every week, then you have a special mindset, and you might be almost. I don't know. This is perhaps a bit philosophical, but you might almost lure the disasters to find you. But if you're not expecting a disaster, you might be better rigged to handle them when they arrive, or not. I don't know. I'm not sure, because I'm just to finish
I was working with in Kashmir after the earthquake in 2006 there, and then it was interesting to note how the local population talked about it, and for them it was fatalism.
Yeah,
they had not prayed good enough, they had not been good enough Muslims, so this was the punishment. So it was not really the fault of the government, which in Sweden we would blame everything
always.
on. There's,
someone has to take responsibility.
Somebody has to take responsibility for this happening, and that something can happen without a clear somebody responsible is unacceptable here in our setting. So I find that sort of, I think is also an easier way to cope with it, that there's something else that we can't control. And I guess it deals with having control, and we are very much of a controlled society, and we have we can plan our agenda a lot. We expect everything to happen according to our own agenda, and then if something breaks that, it disrupts our mind. So in that sense, I think we're more vulnerable because our coping capacity is lower.
But during the last spring, when COVID arrived, when Sweden gradually became famous for having its own strategy, so to speak, which differed from almost every other country, which is a bit exaggerated because it was mainly the same, but it's less harsh. But anyway, people had, I think, a hard time to explain why that was, and there were so many different explanations. Like you said, we haven't had war for 200 years. Some people try to explain it by that because we're not used to disasters, so that's why we think that everything's going to be all right and we don't take the right measures. But on the other hand, you could just look up on that on the other way around. I mean, in that case, the Swedes should be super scared for something like this. But the Finns who'd had two wars 50, 60 years ago, they should. I mean, if you reason that in that way, you could think that the Finns would be very cool about it and think, oh, it's just a pandemic, But they were really, really tough in their measures.
But I think, from the Swedish, I don't think we understand. I mean, now I was living in Lebanon for 5 months during COVID, and understanding how different countries have dealt with it. I don't think we understand the liberty we have still maintained here, and the personal space and ability to choose ourselves, not to have a military at the street corner, not having a policeman writing a check for you on 1,000 euros because you are out walking, not having to register with text messages, I'm going to the pharmacy. That is something we haven't experienced, and I think most people don't even know that that's what normal life is about. And I think, coming back to this policy, I think any policy in any country needs to somehow be adjusted to the spirit of that country and to the soul of that country. And I think here we are not very much of an authoritarian society, and I don't think anybody would want to have policemen with AK-4s at the street corners, or I don't think we would like to have that. I mean, there are some people who advocate for it, but I don't think the population would want that. On the other hand, how can we demand people to take responsibility? I mean, if we travel when I go by bus here or a subway, which I sometimes do, I more prefer to bike, but you can see that some people don't have any respect whatsoever of keeping distance, and they don't care. So I think that balance of having people take responsibility, and I guess it relates back to trust. I worked with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and coming back to how can you need to trust, and the same thing in Lebanon. Nobody trusts the government, and I remember doing some outbreak investigations with WHO in the avian influenza in Egypt, where we looked on how the system was geared to managing avian influenza. And in general, in all these settings, Sierra Leone, Egypt, and Lebanon, there was no trust whatsoever in the government. And so you must trust something else, or you don't trust anything. And in that setting, of course, then the government needs to put somebody with a gun, because there's no trust, and the only thing is people respect is the trigger on
violence. Yeah.
While here,
the threat of violence,
we have some trust, and maybe we put too much confidence in that people will follow the rules and regulations. And but also there's been a rapidly changing society. If I go back 20 or 30 years in time, it was a totally different, more of a controlled society, where you couldn't do as you liked. You had to follow routines, and what your neighbor was saying was a very strong peer pressure. I think that peer pressure has decreased, and Sweden has in that sense become a more modern society, but I still think that trust is there. But of course, for a lot of new groups and young people, it's difficult for them to understand the importance of following these rules.
Yeah, We still have, though, this sense that we don't accept death or disease at all. We think that life should be perfect at all instances, and we have eternal life.
But that's was an interesting thing in Lebanon when we were putting up ICU care, and we were trying, when we were writing the admission criteria to put somebody in ICU, and this was in the public system where we scaled up the number of beds. There were very few available. So we were trying to put, using, some sort of frailty scale that maybe you shouldn't put somebody who's 85 years of age and has these comorbidities, and especially not in ventilators, because the chances, and we saw that when we look on that, many of the hospitals had 100% mortality of those intubated. And we were starting to ask ourselves, so how can it be this? And that comes back to that in Lebanon, that really what you do to your parents or your grandparents is you want to do everything for them.
Yeah.
And really, it doesn't matter if it's not worthwhile. You still want to do it because that's of respect to them. So that's another dimension of not really accepting.
Yes,
death.
It's not just Western.
No.
Western world. I know. I mean, it's a general human trait or feature that.
Yeah, and I found it to be even stronger. It was like even among doctors that they could not say no to somebody who was 95 years old who wanted to be in ICU.
That's
it was
traditional.
impossible.
Also, they have respect for elderly.
And also the belief that palliative care, for example, it basically doesn't exist in the Middle East because it's nobody wants to talk about it. It's a really sensitive subject.
One would think that they had a different view on that, but okay, fascinating. Well, we're all going to die. I mean, I can die the moment I step out of the street here after this interview. You don't know really. Hopefully, I will live a few years more. But so you have been talking a bit about this question here, but how the outside world reacts to disasters. The outside world often being the Western world, the rich world, and the disasters happening in poorer countries. And if there is a reasonable correlation between the needs and the outside response, you have been talking a little bit about that as well. Does the global community react differently to different types of disasters? Are we better at understanding certain types of disasters and less good at understanding other types of disasters? And if so,
absolutely.
Which ones?
And I think particularly what if looking on this WHO mechanisms that we're developing, there's a lot of teams and actors that would like to be ready to go to earthquakes in middle-income countries, natural like. Nepal earthquake, that was really crowded. There were so many teams wanting to go there because you can go in, you can stay 2 weeks, and then you can go home and you've done something clear. But to go to Central African Republic in the conflict and set up something, or at the time Ebola, even though I must say that there was quite a good international response after a while with Ebola when the initial fear had worn off a little bit. And also, which I think is interesting, and I think that's a bit how we need to look upon it, is more from a global health security perspective. I think a lot of these interventions to go to help after disaster has been governed by some sort of charity aspects or humanitarian that we want to help. And then these quality criteria, what we do has not been so important. It's more that we do something. I mean, you can hear in the word humanitarian, it means I am human doing something. It's not what you do, but it's that you are human and you're doing a nice gesture, which is good. It's like a reflex we have to help one another. But my point here and my research is about, okay, let's maintain that instinct, but let's put some knowledge to it, so to make sure that actually what we do is also has real impact and really responds to actual needs. But this global health security, I think, is interesting, and I think now with the COVID vaccination, there's been a lot of discussions now on that very little of the vaccine has gone to low and lower middle income countries, and that most of high income countries are really buying up all the vaccines. And then it seems like from a charity perspective that they want to share it later as they like. But I would like to highlight here the global health security agenda. I mean, if we want to control this virus, and I mean, we'll have to live with it, but I think the quicker we can get down the burden of it, the less chance it is that it will mutate over the years. So for global health security reason, I think we need to think about vaccination. So maybe to leave that charity aspect of why or equity. There's also this idea of equity. But I mean, rather to focus on global health security, we could very much do the vaccinations and create an agenda for it. I think in the West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, that was not a humanitarian intervention. It was global health security, regional stability. That's why the US military was there. That was why the British army was there. They were not there for humanitarian purposes. They were there to stabilize the region. And we saw the same thing in Congo, that the interventions to stop Ebola was only about global health security. And, whether a mother or a child was dying of some other reason, it was not part of their mandate. But if we're talking about something specific, such as vaccinations, I think that can be done. Clearly, you can clearly create an agenda for doing it and for creating political buy-in to it that goes beyond charity, because charity is something that's done on the weekends. It's not. So I think we can.
So it would be a smarter strategy to in order to control the pandemic.
I think
to vaccinate
to convince,
maybe children in poor countries rather than elderly in rich countries.
No, I think that what we need to do, and this has had some discussion with some African colleagues. I think we should focus on vaccinating healthcare staff, of course, and then also, of course, those most vulnerable, old with other conditions. But for the rest, if you ask a Minister of Health in an African countries, how they want to use their money, and here we must remember that the difference of a country like Congo, where there's $15 per person per year, as compared to the US, where they have more than $10,000 per person per year. So the difference between the poorest and the richest in terms of health expenditures per capita is 650 times.
Yeah, it's extreme.
So you cannot have the same type of policy. You need to adapt. So then these $15 or $30, whatever they have, that will be gone with two vaccination, only buying the vials for the rest of the population. So then you don't have any money for any other thing. And we have a big risk
unless
here,
it's paid for by the outside world.
Yeah, and then if it's paid from the outside world, using that global health security agenda, for sure you can do that. But then it's maybe not healthcare, it's something else. But I think there's so much else to do in a health system. And if you ask the Minister of Health, I'm quite sure they will come with other priorities than vaccinating the children. I think we have to deal with this virus, and apparently the virus is not so dangerous for children, and it's not circulating so much there. So, and we know also that in sub-Saharan Africa, in low-income countries, that half of the population is under 18 years of age, so which means that you don't have so many people actually.
And we haven't seen that many cases in Africa, that many, especially not that many deaths.
No.
Well, the statistics are wobbly, perhaps, but still, it doesn't.
But last few weeks there's been an increase. But what's interesting to note, a lot of ministers have died now in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. So, and that's maybe more of a sign that the old people with comorbidities, that somehow it's quite. And a country like Tanzania, where we don't know anything because officially COVID doesn't exist in Tanzania. So. But I think for a majority, meaning the young one, this is not a big issue.
No.
And I don't think it will put pressure either on the virus in terms of mutating in the same sense that among somebody who's immunocompromised and 60 or 70 years old, that is a different story. So we need to put everything on the agenda. And the risk here, of course, is that this COVID vaccination becomes another vertical project. And I guess we could do that if it's sort of for the global health security agenda, but then things need to be separated out why we do it.
Do you think, talking about Africa here, do you think that it was a big mistake by these countries, many of these countries, to impose lockdowns early on because of the lesser effect that the virus has on the populations in sub-Saharan Africa?
It seemed like
it's been detrimental to their other health issues.
it seems like that closing down and everybody was sort of celebrating that they won over COVID, and then boom, they get it in their face now 6 months later. I think the main, closing down of the country was also meaning that a lot of people went into poverty. And also, which I think is a really big problem, is that children have not continued to go to school. And that, I think if Sweden has done something good here, is to show that actually children should go to school. And so I think that will be the contribution, that we didn't close the schools here. And I think that was probably the most important thing that we showed the world. And I think there are very few countries now that are closing the school, because children does not tend to drive this epidemic. And also teachers doesn't seem to be more infected than others. So, and I think that is something very important and you're talking about vaccinations, etc. So children most probably should not be vaccinated. It's and especially not if you have other options to use the limited resources in a low-income country.
Well, generally the speed and the scope of the reaction to this pandemic was the global response rather was unprecedented. We haven't seen that kind of reaction before. I mean, we've had pandemics before several, and I mentioned in the beginning here the Spanish flu, which killed, of course, many more people, and young people was much more dangerous than this virus. But there were no lockdowns as far as I know, but of course then we had the First World War just before that, so it was a particular situation. But I don't think actually, not even during wartime, we've had lockdowns of the scale that we've seen now. Curfews, I mean, in countries that have been at peace for a very long time. So why do you think these sweeping measures happened this time around and never before? Why do you think this happened?
Because China started.
You think so?
Yeah.
Explain, elaborate.
No, they contained it, and they were very quick and showing. And I think to go against what the Chinese did, I think it would have been very difficult for a lot of countries. So I think they showed this is possible to do.
But did we know that in March?
Well, we saw what they did, and then I think they did it very early. And from our point, it came much later here, and it had, I think, more in that sense, more severe effects. But I remember watching a documentary, I think it must have been in March, from where they welded together doors in China. So they did it very strongly. And I think, so from the politician side point of view, and I think that's really where we've had the discussion there. Our chief epidemiologist has said that everybody went crazy because, these type of measures that had never been used before suddenly were being implemented. And that would be my take home from it, that we
So they were impressed by China?
Well, they saw no other type of, they wanted to do something, and I think the politicians has to show, and I think that's what the Swedish so-called model has been criticized for, is that it's not been very prompt and very, authoritarian, and here what everybody wanted was to have clear message of what to do. And you could even see in a country like France, where you normally have people protest and challenge. They were totally quiet. There was nobody challenging that lockdown in France, because people were afraid.
People were afraid.
This is probably the correct thing to do.
Easy to control a people that's scared.
Yes. And we've seen that. I mean, now there are opportunities to control a population using this type of fear. So I think that's a bit of a scary part of this.
We have to be a bit careful, perhaps, to see where this goes.
Because you can justify this type of measures by saying we're
and now you can politicians can prolong them and say that, well, we don't know, we're not sure, there's a mutation going on here, so we just keep it like this for another 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. When will it ever end?
No.
I mean, it's...
No, and I think especially in a lot of countries where we've seen riots of political reasons, this is one way of saying controlling them, and there's a number of countries like that where the COVID lockdown has been used to stop protests. We saw that also in Lebanon, because there was a lot of protests after the blast, and then the lockdowns came, and so there's a lot of tension, you can say, and then it's difficult, of course, to be the one breaking a curfew or a lockdown with protests. because then you can be held accountable for spreading the disease. And
yeah. But it is a bit ridiculous sometimes. You see people standing in line when they to board a plane, and they have to be 2 or 3 meters apart, and they all have, of course, face masks. And then 15 minutes later, they sit in the plane like 2 decimeters apart from each other. So I mean, some things really don't make sense. But anyway, I had on the podcast also Martin Kulldorff, a Swedish doctor who's signed this famous or fairly famous Great Barrington Declaration, group of doctors who are very critical to the harshest forms of lockdowns. And they mean that the collateral damage of those are worse than the actual disease. I mean, you can, of course, debate whether that is true or not. But he said that when this happened, you explained this reaction with politicians being impressed by China. And maybe that's true, because he said that he was so shocked that all the contingency plans, all the preparedness plans that were for pandemics that were in place. I mean, WHO has had them for many years. They were just ditched, thrown out the window within weeks, and never followed. I mean, there weren't talk about closing borders. There weren't talk about closing down schools. None of that. So it's just like new rules.
I think that's very challenging to have this old sort of evidence and practice rules in this type of new network society, where the words and rumors are being spread. So I would assume that and here I think we can also look on the Swedish so-called model, that you have to adapt it to the changing context in terms of what the population looks like, how social media is using. So I think what we have, we are a bit conservative in that sense when it comes to what we think is the best strategy. But maybe it has to somehow be tested and adapted, and how does it function among a younger population that gets their information and from other sources that we are used to. I mean, in the Swedish system, you should be if there's this siren that echoes, you should close the doors and turn on the radio. Most people don't even have a radio nowadays. So I think that the rapidly changing landscape needs the policies we have to be adapted, which is difficult, and because we're also very much fact based. This is the way it should be, but if the reality looks different, or if it's interpreted in a different way, then I mean, we want people to follow it and to do what they're told, but that is very difficult, especially when people become afraid, and then trust comes back again. As I said before, I mean, you need to have some trust, and how to nurture trust. I think it's so important, and that's something I've been fascinated about, how at least in countries, most countries, they trust their own system, even though it can vary. So if you compare Norway with Sweden, for example, you can see there's a lot of
nationalism.
Yeah, and you can see that the Norwegians think that what we did was look at our, and then the Swedes say, yeah, but we have had more freedom, and then so
it's a bit ridiculous, really. I mean, the differences are so small, so we shouldn't really.
No, but it creates rally around the flag type of situations,
like sports
that type of unfortunately, but. And I also think the long-term effects of this we have not seen yet. I mean, a country like Portugal, for example, that was during the spring and early autumn was seen as the great example of how you could
hailed
do it.
For its good.
And now, pang, boom, it's one of the worst countries with the highest mortality. It can change very quickly. And that's something I learned with this virus, that don't be too sure, don't make. So and things
we can't make an assessment until maybe in a couple of years'
time. It
time.
doesn't follow our normal logic, this virus, for sure.
No.
It doesn't develop, and it's very difficult to predict, and so I think we have to be very humble, and despite that we have to make plans, we have to have predictions and for the future, and so you have to have a system of monitoring things basically in real time to understand how to adapt. It's very difficult to plan. It's more difficult than planning the weather or seeing what the weather would look like.
Yeah,
and that I think that's one of the main challenges. That it's a very difficult.
So this
virus.
is early question to ask, perhaps, then, considering what you just said. But what do you think will be the main takeaway from the pandemic when we look back in a couple of years or 3 years or so?
Well, I think on one hand, it will be, on how difficult this global institution has had to maintain their relevance and like EU or the UN, that these type of mechanisms haven't been very successful in united. It's like people have retracted to even in Sweden, you suddenly Stockholm, we don't know what's going on in other parts of the country. It becomes very localized in that sense. So I think that will be one dimension. On the other hand, I think the understanding of that this type of pandemics can happen, and also we, in that sense, we've been lucky this time that it has not been worse. I've been thinking about that, the healthcare, that we managed to expand the healthcare system to cope. Very few. There are some countries, of course, where it's gone over the top, but for the rest, it's stayed. But what about if it had been 10 times as
intense?
Yeah. What would have happened then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I was part of also developing this field hospital in Älvsjömässan, being
which was never used, actually.
No, and then I remember I was in the county council. We were discussing whether to open it, and then it was just had it been 10 more cases, then they would have.
But then it went down there in May, June.
They managed to in mid-April to maintain and really building out more and more beds. So, but it never went over the top, so to say. So that, it could have had 1,000 beds there. So then it really would be a pandemic hospital. But that didn't happen. So I think in most countries we managed. I mean, Portugal now, they have help from Germany with doctors flying in and setting up facilities. So, but it's really on the margins. It's not that we've been totally overwhelmed.
No. And also in disasters, if this is a disaster, you have to adapt to the situation. So when it gets difficult, you just have to increase the resources, I guess, and focus it on where it's needed. So,
and what we can see in Lebanon now, for example, is that people are staying at home. They get oxygen concentrators. They can get cortisone treatment at home by doctors or by friends and colleagues. So a lot of people, which means that those that come to the hospital, they are extremely sick. So they will always be ready for going to the intensive care unit.
Care, which they don't have.
So nobody goes to the hospital unless they really, really, really need extra this high flow oxygen or something like that. So a lot of the healthcare has been done in at home based, and that's also very interesting. How much can we manage at home, and that hasn't
perhaps
been explored.
That's something for the future.
Yeah.
Okay. There's so much to say about disasters, and as we said, they come in many forms. If you look globally and historically here, the number of deaths in disasters has gone down dramatically over the decades, as you know, and protective measures are also immensely more efficient. You mentioned Bangladesh than just some decades ago. Is this development acknowledged, would you say?
I think this is an interest. We're going to have a seminar about the myths of disasters. And I think one myth is that more people are dying. I think it's very difficult to grasp with the climate change and all these other threats that we have to accept that actually 2018-19 has been the low and has only 10,000 people officially died from natural disasters. Then, of course, indirect effects such as poverty, etc. That's a different thing.
But that's nothing new either.
No. So historically, there's never been so few people that have died, despite that we have more people now living on the.
But people don't like to hear that.
No. And it doesn't fit the narrative somehow and there's a lot of this type of myths when it comes to disaster. For example, that dead bodies spread diseases and epidemics and
classic myth.
So it's a lot of these. But I think that it's something old and it's very in relation to myth, and we have very preconceived opinions about it. And my Hans Rosling was my PhD supervisor, and he he taught me a lot of things, but you need to think and really debunking all these old preconceived opinions, if there are, but really trying to look for the facts, and here, at least when it comes to direct death, that has gone down. But of course, with climate change, there's a lot of more hazards upcoming. So we really need to work on reducing the vulnerability, and especially when it comes to financial and property loss, etc. That is really a big issue, that people lose that and fall into poverty. So that is another dimension that we need to understand better, but also to support people following disasters, and not only go there to save their lives or whatever and then go home.
But if it's become, I mean, factually better, fewer people are dying, it doesn't mean that we should stop doing things and stop helping people. Of course, I mean that's a no-brainer. But do you think it would be difficult for people to, or would more people think that way, that we don't have to do anything, if they knew that it's actually becoming better, or is it encouraging for people to know that things are actually getting better? We can do something. I mean, how should one look at this? What's the psychology behind these?
I think there are two dimensions. I think a lot of agencies that are working with disaster response, they want to maintain the momentum to also, on one hand, of course, collect money, but also keeping the focus on those most vulnerable, which is important. But I also think that people need good news to understand, and then probably also that we need to invest more in prevention, like we said with Bangladesh, for example. Don't wait until the disasters happen. We know what the hazards are. We know where the vulnerabilities are, and we can work on this. But it seems very difficult to raise funds to prevent things. It's like it's not until something happens that we react. And then that we react, I think is very good, that we have this humanitarian imperative. It's like a reflex. We want to do something. But the challenge is here, so how can we make better use of these resources? And we need to have both. Of course, disasters will continue to happen. It's like traffic accidents. So 1.4 million people die every year from traffic accidents.
So close down all the traffic, right?
So we need to work on improving traffic safety and road traffic safety. But we also need to have those trauma hospitals ready to take care of those that are injured. So. And that sometimes, that public health and sort of curative care, they are sometimes looked upon separate things. And I have the fortunate of coming very much from clinical care, and I also now work more with public health. So I can see the value of prevention, vaccinations, etc. But I also see the importance of really having assistance once it has happened. And that seems to be a bit difficult, because you have specialists in public health, they only see the prevention. Then you have the other ones that are specialists on the trauma care, and they only see that. I think we need to see both. And also to keep two thoughts in the same time now with vaccinations and low-income countries, let us think about the health system. Let's make sure that the vulnerability doesn't increase, that vaccination programs for children continue. If everybody's going to be vaccinated for COVID, what will happen with measles vaccination and polio for children? So it's
already gone down, hasn't it?
Yes, and that's so we see actually that poverty has started to increase due to lockdowns and indirect effects. And that it's difficult to keep two thoughts
at the same time.
The same time, but here we really need to have it and see that there's not one solution to it.
That was something that Professor Hans Rosling often said, and you mentioned him, and I think you started the Swedish section of Doctors Without Borders in the 80s, and he passed away a few years ago, and I was fortunate enough to also work a little bit with him, not as much as you did, but so I got to know him, which was great. And he was, of course, Swedish people know who he is, and people in other countries might not know it, but he worked tirelessly with digging up facts that showed that the world was a better place than most people thought. But then, so he became famous as an optimist, but that annoyed him a little bit, because he never wanted to call himself an optimist. So he adamantly said that I'm not an optimist, I'm a possibilist. So he invented this. I don't know if he invented it, but he called himself a possibilist. Me personally, I never really understood the problem with optimism. I think optimism is a responsible way of looking at things, because then you think there's a point in doing something. If you're a pessimist, there's no point in doing anything. So anyway, what's your stance on this? Would you call yourself a possibilist or an optimist?
I think this Portuguese author José Saramago, who got the Nobel Prize, he said that the optimists, they don't want to change anything. It's only the pessimists that are. So I think you can turn it around.
Okay. But if you're a pessimist, then you think everything's gonna
well, and that
go
to
down the
trigger
drain.
that. So
Yeah.
no, but I think I'm very much inspired by Hans, and so, but I'm probably more of a realist, I guess. But I think you can also to have a positive or a negative view on what the world looks like. And if you look historically, I mean, things have improved dramatically, which doesn't mean there are problems, but I mean, it's been a linear increase in wealth in when I started, the child mortality has gone down with over 50%. Of course, you can be upset that it hasn't gone down by 100%, but it was 12-13 million in the early 2000 when I started out, and now it's 4 or 5 million children under 5 that die. So we've had dramatic effects, and vaccination. 85% of all the children are vaccinated against measles, etc. So children go to school more than before. So there's a lot of good things that has happened, but sometimes it seems, I mean, again, having two thoughts in your mind on the same time, and which doesn't mean that there are problems. And we have climate change, which is a huge issue, of course, and migration and conflicts, that people need to leave their house and they cannot stay, and financial problems and that people want to. I think we talk a lot about refugees. I think migration is a bigger issue. There's something like 1 billion people that are migrating, while the number of displaced or refugees is much lower. But people who need to leave because of financial reasons or climate reasons, we don't call them refugees, we call them migrants, and they don't have a legal
I think about
status.
3% of the population of the world are migrants, and it's been like that for 50 years, more or less.
And that, people want a better home. And I used to think about the Swedish history, in the between 1850s and the early 1900s. There's 25% of the Swedish population emigrated from Sweden. 1 million people left to go to America to look for a better future. And they were able to do so because there was still virgin territory there, and even though they stole it from the Indians there, but still there was a future, and I think that view, being an optimist or realist, I think the young people needs to have something to look forward to. They need to have dreams, and I think that is why people start migrating now, because they want a future, and they can't even imagine staying where they are. They want to move on. They want to fulfill their dreams, and that has been through mankind. I think that type of striving from the young generation, and the question is whether we could
accommodate this,
it or forbid them to do this.
I think it's going to be difficult to forbid it, to just put up a wall, but it's a challenge for sure. And I've been talking about this on the podcast before. It's a big issue, as you say, migration. Johan von Schreeb, thank you so much for joining the show, and good luck with your very important task.
Thank you very much.